Eric Purdue, thank you so much for joining me this evening for a quick chat. Eric, you are the translator of a new version of the three books of occult philosophy by Agrippa. How long has it been? Has it been a year, a little bit over a year now?
Uh, it was a year in November.
A year in November.
Yeah,
Okay, okay. It's been a busy time for you
a little
since
bit.
the release. For sure. Just for the viewers of the Foolish Fish channel, Eric reached out to me. Eric is one of the Foolish Fish members, and he's active on the Foolish Fish Discord server on the Agrippa channel, of course. And he offered to have this conversation, and I absolutely leapt on the opportunity because there are two things here that are very close to my own heart. And the first, of course, is the three books of Agrippa. Which are, you could say, the basis of the whole of the Western occult tradition. And the second thing, which is very close to my heart, which is language and translation. I've made quite a few videos on the importance of language and how language affects our reality and so on and so forth. And I really wanted to talk to you about a couple of these topics here. There's this saying in Italian, which is traduttore traditore, which is translator treason. So every act of translation is an act of treason somehow. And I suppose it's a good point. We have to make decisions when we're translating, because do you stick to the word to word? Do you try to convey the feeling? Do you try to convey the meaning? Because some of it is going to have to give. And I was very interested, Eric, to know a little bit about how you approached the translation of the three books of occult philosophy.
Well, thanks for having me.
It's very much my pleasure. Eric, would you like to start off by just introducing yourself a little bit and telling us maybe how you got into translating Agrippa?
My original exposure to magic was through Afro-Cuban Santeria leukemia world. And my teacher, my godfather, we call him godparents, was unusual in that he was well versed in Western esotericism in general. He had this massive library. I'm still envious of it. And he had, it was his office was wall-to-wall books, floor to ceiling, with a hole cut out for the door and the windows. So most of your viewers are going to be jealous of that, I think. So he introduced me to Agrippa probably in the mid 90s, I'm thinking. And he also introduced me to Picatrix back then. And at the time, he didn't have a copy of Picatrix. He had never read it. He just knew about its reputation and basically what its contents were. And at the time, he told me that Picatrix was equivalent to book 2 in 3 books, which isn't really, now we know is not really correct, but that's what he thought at the time. So Agrippa was sort of the stand-in for not having Picatrix. He introduced me to it. We discussed it quite a bit. He passed away in 2005, and it started nagging me. This book, I saw it at a bookstore, and I'm like, I need to read this for myself, And I still have that copy, and I also got a copy of Pingree's critical edition of Picatrix, and that was my first project, was Picatrix, and I was way over my head on that because I didn't really understand. I was starting out with astrology back then, or I was new to traditional astrology, and I didn't understand a lot of the terminology. Things like terms. I thought it was like a word or something like that, or an ending, like end of the sign. I had no idea what it meant. So eventually Christopher Warnock published his version of it, or I heard he was doing it and that he was close. And I'm like, I'm just gonna let this go because I want to let it be his problem. Because I was struggling with it so much. And so some time passed, and I started making comparisons with Agrippa, and that's why I started noticing some issues with the JF version. And also talking with Christopher Warnock, because he had already identified a lot of issues with it. And so as an experiment, I decided to try the first 10 chapters just to see what would happen. And
just for the viewers, the JF version is the version that can be found in Donald Tyson's edition. Is that correct?
It's the only English version before this. Yeah, it was written, I think, in 1651, if I remember correctly. Yes, that was the only English translation, and the astrology in that translation is pretty atrocious. And I don't know why. Actually, I've never satisfied myself with an explanation, because that astrology was the astrology back then. I don't know why he would have misunderstood a lot of these words, but I decided to start with the first 10 chapters, and I immediately noticed the need. It didn't take very long. I mean, I think in one of the first chapters, JF mentions a book of Pluto, which I know Tyson made a footnote about that, and it made it really seem like there was a lost book or something. And it's Plato. It was a typo. I mean, but I mean, unless you read the Latin, not even Latin. If you look, you have to actually look at the source, because I think that if I remember correctly, there was a typographical error in Agrippa. I don't think Agrippa made that error. I mean, he may have, but I don't think he did. If you look at his source, it's ambiguous. If it's Plato or Pluto, because italics.
Wow.
But it was Plato. So I started noticing things like that, and also I didn't really realize the depth of the sources at the time, and that really, at least as far as non-academic world, that really hadn't been explored too deeply. So I thought, well, hell, I'll reveal this, reveal these sources that everyone is arguing about.
Nice. Well, yeah,
I didn't take it very seriously at first.
Sure, you didn't start off thinking, okay, I'm going to get through these 3 books, get them published. No, I suppose you wouldn't have got started if that had been.
No, it took me a long time to even think of it in terms of letting other people see it. It was just a sort of a private thing, and then I think Christopher Warnock actually was a big cheerleader on that. He goes, no, you have to release this.
Thank goodness, thank goodness you did, because it certainly replaced what I previously had for me on my shelf. I've got it over here, it's that's the reason there's a little space on my shelf over here. I brought it down here to show it off.
There's a space in your shelf. I don't believe it.
I know, obviously not for long anyway. Yeah, it's a beautiful edition, and you were saying that the price is coming down at the moment on marketplaces.
They've been. I think on Amazon it's like $130 or something like that now.
That's very impressive. I mean, many of the viewers of the channel have probably seen my review, but it's a 3-part, 3 beautifully bound volumes in cloth, which is unusual at this price point. I mean, you can pay that much for a single book, let alone 3 large books. It's very cool, very nice. With the ribbon. I know. I can't help myself. I see a beautiful book, I get a bit dizzy, it's the way it happens. How
like
long
big books,
did
you
it
cannot
take?
lie.
Right. How long did it take you, Eric, to translate the whole thing in the end?
I think the first draft took me about, I don't know, 4 years, something like that, 5 years. Right. Okay. And then the drafts. I mean, I think we did, I don't know, 8 or 9 drafts of it.
Goodness. So from day one to publishing, we're talking.
It was about, I think it was either 10 or 11 years. There were some delays in the. There's a spotted publishing history here. And not to throw anybody under the bus, but there was a delay with one of the publishers, not Intertraditions. Yeah, it could have been out probably 4 years earlier than it was.
Okay. All right. But the translation process itself, you said for the first draft.
Yeah, 4 or 5.
4 or 5 years.
You would not want to read that version, though.
Right.
I always start out with a very literal translation.
Okay.
It's just shy of sounding like Yoda.
Right.
Yeah,
I mean, translating Latin is going to be inevitable, isn't it? Yeah.
And then I just go through and then I start kind of rearranging things, breaking up sentences, Englishing it.
Of course. I wanted to ask you about the kinds of challenges that arose in the process of translating it. There must have been some.
Yeah, the Hebrew was an issue because, I mean, I don't read Hebrew, so there's that. But I can copy letters, and this sounds really. I don't know how many people are aware of this. It sounds silly, but Microsoft Word messes with right to left languages, not just Hebrew, but
yes.
So it was I got to the point because basically what would happen is it would rearrange words randomly, and in some cases it would push words into the middle of a different paragraph. It was just doing very strange things, and I eventually got to the point through connections. I was able to speak with a Microsoft Office developer, and his answer was, "That's by design."
Boy, gee, thanks.
And I'm thinking, how? But the fix is that they don't like it when you mix a right to left language in the middle of a left to right language, like in the same line. So we'd do a lot of tweaking.
You shouldn't be doing it.
You shouldn't be doing it.
Boy.
And my question is, what about the State Department? I mean, do they not write anything in Hebrew and Arabic?
Right.
Anyway. But luckily, the managing editor of Intertraditions reads Hebrew, and she said, "Yep, I know your pain." And she identified a lot of issues because there was one of the things that I didn't know, because I was using the critical edition by Vittorio Campani, by pronunciation Campani, I think, the Brill one, and I was using that above the Agrippa, because if you look at the original Agrippa, the Hebrew is very difficult to read. The font is difficult for me to read. So I was using the critical edition, and she informed me that it was wrong. That there's one passage it's basically a Hebrew paragraph, and it's a quote from the Bible, and she said it was wrong, and it's a very common prayer that Jewish people do today. And so she asked me to send her a copy of the original Agrippa, and she said, "Oh, he's correct." So that's when I learned that you probably shouldn't correct Agrippa. But that was a
good
huge
to know,
surprise.
isn't it?
Yeah, it was a huge surprise, because I assume the critical edition's unassailable. It's peer reviewed and everything.
So just for viewers who might not be in an academic context, what is a critical edition?
So a critical edition is, it's most commonly used for manuscripts, but it doesn't have to be. Agrippa is not a manuscript. I mean, 3 books isn't.
Sure.
It was always printed. But what they do is they take all of the available versions of a text, and they note all of the differences. Usually there's a separate volume, or in the case of 3 books, it was just footnotes. But some books, they have a separate volume that's called an apparatus criticus that has all the differences. And then they'll make sort of like an ideal version of the book. That's what happened here. There's I don't know, I think there were 4, editions of 3 books, and each one of them had a little bit of variations. So she went through and just basically made judgment calls. Okay. But that's what's nice about it, because if you aren't sure, then you can always just look. And also most of those editions are available for download. So I was able to look at facsimile copies. And through one of the miracles of history to me is Agrippa's original manuscript that he sent to Trutemius still exists. And she also noted, she was able to reconstruct what that original manuscript was. And most of it's not that notable. I mean, it's the final version is much larger. But there are a few passages that are quite different. I actually footnoted a few of those as well because I thought it was worth knowing that. But that was a big challenge. Was that I almost threw my computer across the room a couple of times. The other challenge was really just tracking down all the sources. I can't take credit for doing as much legwork as the Brill edition Compagni did. But is that the right pronunciation in Italian? Compagni, I think. I don't know. I apologize to Italians everywhere. But anyway, she did. She has a list of all the sources. But thanks to the internet, I was able to get copies of almost all of them. So I went through and I double checked everything, and there were a few things that I disagreed with, and I found a few that she didn't have, thanks to the internet. Basically, so I didn't take anything for granted with it. I pretty much assumed that I had to double check everything. So that took a long time.
I can imagine it did. If you can't be absolutely sure of the critical edition, even then
right.
then yeah.
Well, no, it's not her fault. I mean, I don't. It's not a blame thing. It's that
literally
it really isn't, because I mean, critical editions were made by people.
Yeah, that's right.
And so things are going to happen. So it's not a. I'm thankful that we have it because it made it easier to work on.
Of course. All right. Well, maybe Eric, you could tell us a little bit about what sets your translation apart from the other translations. Around the same time as your translation appeared, Paul Summers Young also published a translation through Black Letter Press, which is also very, very loved, and I have it on my shelf over here. It reads very differently. It's very approachable. It's very easy to read. But my understanding is that when Paul Summers Young's translation came out, you were already done, and it was the book was already in the publishing process. So yeah, tell us a little bit about the strengths of your particular translation, and what sets it apart.
Well, what I try to do is, I mean, I basically wrote the book that I wanted to have. And so what I tried to do is the first approach is to make it easier to read in, modern 21st century English, and to correct the errors that cropped up in the JF translation and the Tyson footnotes. And then third, to note down as best as I could all of the sources and where they appeared in each passage. And I wanted to compare every edition available that I could find. And so I compared the original Latin, the original JF, Tyson, and I would have included Paul's if it was available when I did it, but it was too late, so I didn't. But,
of course.
But yeah, it's I don't want to be hard on Tyson, because what he did was monumental. It's not easy to do what he did. He especially did it since he did it before the internet. And the internet is a huge aid for things like this, because you could just do text searches on the internet. And so he was doing this by hand. So, and also the critical edition came out only about a year before his did, so he probably wasn't even aware of it at that time. So that would have made his life easier too, but just wasn't there. But I think some people may not be aware that it's important to remember that Tyson's edition came out 30 years ago, and I think almost exactly 30 years ago. And a lot's happened in the astrology world, the occult world, the academic world in 30 years. There's a lot. I mean, really, I think there's been an entire revolution
Especially
since then.
these particularly 30 years. That's right. It's been
Yeah.
incredible, hasn't it?
And, in astrology, I can see it mostly in astrology where, the traditional revival started in the 80s. And that was only in not even natal astrology. That was mostly horary, which is answering a question based on a chart. Where did I lose my keys? That kind of thing.
Sure.
That was the main thing that was happening in the late 80s, early 90s, and we simply just did not have a lot of translations yet. So again, Tyson just wouldn't know. I mean, because it wasn't there. And since then, I think it's safe to say I think we've had all of the major astrological texts back to the classical world, or the Hellenistic world. Yeah, classical world. I'll say that. They're in English now. We have even a lot of Arabic material. So, we now have the books that Agrippa and people of Agrippa's world would have had, and we can read those normally in English now. So now, when you read Agrippa and he mentions an Almuten, when Tyson was around, he would have had no idea what an Almuten was. No one was talking about it back then. And one of my favorite mistranslations, this was actually from JF's side, was he translated an astrological term which is profection as perfection. And so Tyson's reading it, and of course it wouldn't have stood out as an error, right? So he made a footnote saying that a perfection is the full moon or new moon. I can't remember, new or full moon or both. And but it's not. It's a predictive tool, and it's something completely different. So if you're just kind of going by that, you might be getting a not correct view of what
the most
up to
date information. Yes, about
no. So I really wanted to address that. But just the fact that we can now look at the sources. I was able to download or buy or download something like over 95% of the books that Agrippa used. There's a couple I couldn't find, but almost all of them I could. I was saying it improved as I was doing it, because I wanted to get Ficino's complete works, and I got it from the library as an interlibrary loan, and it was this massive. It's like this thick and huge, 2 volumes, and I was carrying these things like it was the 10 Commandments. And anyway, I scanned every single page of that, and then about, I don't know, a year later or something like that, it pops up on Google Books.
Yeah, not your scan, I hope.
No, it wasn't mine.
Yeah.
It was a better scan too.
Wow. Oh my goodness.
It was like, I can't remember, it was like 2,000 pages I scanned. It was ridiculous.
Yeah. More and more libraries are making their materials available, aren't they? It's still not perfect, but it's getting better.
Yeah, the German National Library was a godsend. They have an incredible collection. And I mean, it's no surprise that Agrippa was in Germany, so
right, yes, of
helped
course.
out a
lot. Eric, let's talk a little bit about the text and how maybe it affected you. And when you translate a text, you invariably get quite familiar with it. I mean, it's because you're thinking about every single word, and you're spending quite a lot of time on every sentence. Are there any insights into the text that you'd like to share with the viewers?
I think one of the things that struck me, and it may sound boring, but a lot of 3 books is fairly Ficino heavy. There's a lot of Ficino quotes in there, and there are quite a few sections that are quoted from Ficino's Platonic Theology, which I highly recommend anybody to read that. It's available. I think it's, I don't know, 6 volumes, 5 volumes, something like that. And but anyway, there's this one section where he talks about the parts of the soul, which in the JF version he translated those as mind, reason, and sense. And the sense part of it, the Latin is idolum, and which literally translates, I mean, it's idol, which that's not terribly controversial, but it doesn't really make sense by itself. And I left it untranslated because it's almost like it became like a term of art. Like it's one of those things, if you translate it literally, it doesn't make sense. I don't know if Ficino chose that word, actually. But the idea of it is that if you think of reality as being a chain, you have the link, you have the top of the link, which connects to the bottom of the link above it. Yeah. And then you have the bottom of the link, which links to the top of the link below it. And then you have like this middle. And that's the chain of correspondences. So those three parts are supposed to mean like the mind connects to the idolum, or the foot of the level above it, and then the idolum, our idolum, links to the link of the chain below us. And for some reason that just really stuck with me. I had to leave it untranslated because if I said sense, it doesn't make sense.
Right.
It not that it's wrong, it gets lost.
Yeah.
And there was another one where JF technically translated it correctly, where he mentions, this is kind of, I don't know, for me this was again, it sounds boring, but it was kind of a big deal for me. But he has this throwaway passage that mentions that that numbers are formal. That's the way JF translated it. And when you say formal, you're thinking, oh, it's like a tuxedo, or or it's it's something that's very like established or something like that. But then I realized that what we actually meant was that it's of the realm of forms, like in Plato. And that got me thinking a lot about the nature of numbers, and that really kind of fits in with astrology. Because Agrippa doesn't say this, but the implication is that that's also what the signs are. The signs are non-physical things that are part of the forms, of the world of the forms. And numbers have this kind of weird state of being where they are non-physical, but they are kind of physical at the same time. Like you can't touch a number 2, but you can have 2 of something. So there's like this non-physical concept, and you have a physical part of it as well. And anyway, so Agrippa would throw out these kind of like these passages like that, and I had to rethink of the words sometimes. And those are 2 examples that really stood out as throwaway statements that made me rethink a lot of things.
Yes.
The numbers one hit me a lot for some reason.
Yeah, I mean, again, when you see the word formal, the idea of the formative world is not the first thing that springs to mind. So yes, that would get lost, of course. Would there be any passages in Agrippa's work that could be useful on a practical level? Of course, these are 3 books of occult philosophy, right. But and we tend to think of the 4th book attributed to Agrippa at the very least as the more practical one. But are there any practical things in the 3 books?
I think philosophy is practical.
Certainly, of course, it's the basis of a practice.
But to your question, I don't want to be too much of a troll. It's not really a passage, but it's in book 1. It's chapter 5 and 6. Stood out because it has those are the 2 chapters that go through the descriptions of the 4 elements. And what's interesting is that in today the elements have gotten sort of, I don't know, they're not taken as seriously except as a descriptive tool, and that's part of it's part of the role of the elements anyways. Is there's a descriptive element to it that's always there. But what's interesting is that I think people forget of elements as being qualitative, and something that you can actually describe and experience. I think then the impulse is that we now know there's more than 4 elements, or we conceptualize elements differently today, sodium or whatever. But from a magical perspective, the 4 elements are still true because they're speaking qualitative differences. So, like, for instance, you have earth, which the element of earth, which can alter when you add water to it. It becomes like mud, so becomes more watery. You can bake it, so it becomes more fiery, and you can theoretically evaporate. But water might be a better description. But yeah, the Agrippa's sections on that have a wonderfully descriptive and almost poetic description of the elements, which I don't think I've seen anywhere else. And it's I don't know, it's just a very unique section. So I think that if you want to have kind of a new approach to such a really basic concept as elements,
yes, the elements are very central and very
they are
at the start of many practices, aren't they? Yeah.
But they're abstract though to people. Like for instance, in Golden Dawn ceremonies, you have all these things you do to the 4 elements, but there's something that doesn't almost feel real about it. About not the Golden Dawn, but I mean the idea of doing something for the elements.
Yeah. So those 5th and 6th chapters of the first book,
right, chapters 5 and 6,
some insight into the elements.
Yeah,
fantastic.
It's almost like a chapter of adjectives.
Okay. Is there maybe when I was reading the passages that I read, there was a chapter about a fish that can stop a ship by attaching itself to it.
Echinonesia or something like that.
Yeah, something along those lines.
I'm getting a blank right now.
Not all of Agrippa's suggestions always make 100% sense in the modern
Echinonesia.
Echinonesia, that's the one. As I was saying, not everything that Agrippa says stands up to modern day science. Are there any maybe passages that stuck with you that seemed particularly egregious or silly?
Well, I think there's 2 sides to this, because that exact example is in at least in a few places. He mentions it, I think, 3 or 4 times. But part of the context is where he talks about magical contagion. So in a way, it's a ridiculous example of something that is useful. It's supposed to be a description of something that is useful, but but as far as this period, the one that I don't see any usefulness for is throughout the book he quotes Horapollo, who wrote a book on hieroglyphics. Mind you, he couldn't read hieroglyphics, and the whole book is completely bogus. And so Agrippa mentions or quotes from this quite a bit, and one of the ones, I mean, he just throws it out there. I think it was a section about how we've learned about the cures of things through watching animals' behavior, and one of these is that a lion cures its own headaches by eating an ape. And I don't know where that came from. And so I can argue that the Echinonesia could be useful from an abstract, standpoint, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure where that one comes in.
The ape famously known for its pain-killing properties. Okay.
Yeah, and you kind of wonder, like, who does somebody watch this? Like what was the scene? Oh. Like, oh man,
yes.
Where's the ape? We're fresh out of ape.
Beautiful, absolutely beautiful. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Good example. Good example.
Fresh out
And
of egg,
are
by
there?
the way.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Are there any useful recipes or elections that you think that everyone should know that might get buried in the book?
Some of it's buried, some of it isn't. The incense section's pretty unburied. It's pretty well known. But there are a lot of astrological elections. You do have to know astrology to do these. I mean, well, with varying degrees of difficulty. Some of it's fairly simple. One of my favorite ones is I call it the anti-gentrification talisman. But all you do is while Mars is in is afflicted by sign, that you would carve the sigil or the symbol of Mars in copper, which is going to be the metal of Venus. So Venus is the planet that's opposite in nature to Mars. And so, yeah, basically it would be while Mars is in Taurus, Libra, or Cancer. So those are the three signs that Mars is not terribly happy in. And you can do anywhere in that sign, actually. And yeah, put that on copper plate, and then you just bury it, and it's supposed to destroy buildings.
Okay.
And I'm looking at you, Amazon. No, anyway. I'm in Seattle, so. No, I'd love to get a lot of people doing this. Actually, I think it'd be great to try that. Just because anybody can do this, and copper is easy to get, and it's easy to wait until Mars. I mean, I think Mars is coming up in Cancer anyway, so yeah, just have an army of people. Like it's black magic's legal, by the way. So
it is nowadays.
It is, yeah. So anyway, but yeah, there's also a whole section in book 2, or sorry, yeah, book 2, and what I have to look it up really quick because I can't remember. It's quoted from Thabit Ibn Qurra. Actually, I have it right here. Oh, chapter 50, book 2. He's a famous Arabic writing astrologer, and it has all of these fairly complex elections on doing things like bringing people together, making your house secure, curing the stings of scorpions. But there's a lot of little practical elections in there, and actually I don't think it's very hard to take some of that logic. Once you understand astrology, you can take that logic and use it for a lot of things. But there's a lot of like strengthening marriages. There's ones for destroying marriages, which I don't recommend. But who doesn't want a strong marriage? So, and destroying buildings, which is, I think we're coming back to gentrification. So,
Nice. There's a recurring theme here. Yes. Okay.
You know what? I think we're all bitter about the real estate world right now.
Yeah.
So.
Right. Nice. Okay. Are there any rituals in the 3 books of occult philosophy?
There aren't a lot of rituals. It's mostly on what magic is and things you need to know, but it doesn't actually sit you down and say, okay, do this circle, do these actions. It's a very it's a philosophical text.
Okay.
Yeah. But I will say, but people tend to think that it's not useful though because of that. And that's one of the things I want to get people out of the mode of is because a lot of people look at magic books as reference books and also as recipe books, which a lot of them are recipe books, but I think that it's more important to understand why you're doing something and what you're doing.
Yes.
Because really, a lot of these grimoires were written, to remember things that could be forgotten, maybe for students. There's a whole bunch of reasons why they could have been written. But the problem is that we sometimes, I think, take these out of context. Like we're in the 21st century, and we just have this book of recipes that we just attack and perform. And I'm not going to say it doesn't work. I mean, people derive a lot of usefulness from it, but when you compare it with the world that they came from, that's coming from a world. Yeah, if you could read back then and you could afford to buy a book, chances are you were probably educated. So I think that a lot of times these grimoires come from the world of the wealthy, but even if it's not, it's coming from a world that objectively believed in magic.
Yes.
Whereas our world today does not objectively believe in magic. Some individuals do, but the world itself doesn't.
Correct.
And that's a huge difference. So that's one of the things about reading 3 books, is that it's one of the few books that kind of immerse you into that world and that way of thinking. And it takes a long time, I think, to train our brains to accept a sort of a non-materialistic divine world that Agrippa would have lived in. That's one of the greatest, I think, useful things about the book, is understanding a different worldview. And that was a challenge for me. Like, I come from the world of Afro-Cuban religion, and I got thrown into it when I was about 19 by accident. But I basically had to reconcile to myself very easily, or very quickly, that I have a certain upbringing, but here I am dealing with people who are under possession. Yeah, I had to very quickly sort of absorb this. So by the time I came to working on traditional astrology and astrological magic and studying Agrippa, I was kind of already converted. But still, there's times where I have to be like, okay, we all have those moments where it's like, okay, this isn't real,
Of course.
That's the way it is. And it's nice to be, it's sort of like you have to train your brain, so it's a good book for that.
Yes, there's certainly. Are there any tips, Eric, for people who are interested in studying occult philosophy or mysticism that you'd like to share, just as a last point?
Yeah. I don't like to throw books at people, literally and figuratively. Because because I don't think it's always helpful. And I really feel that one of the flaws of the occult world is that we're very book-based. As much as I love books, they don't give you the whole story. One of my recent discoveries is that there's a podcast called The Secret History of Western Esoteric Philosophy. It's more of an academic podcast. But he's systematically going through and discussing texts. I know I'm going to sound like I'm contradicting myself, but texts and concepts, I guess, from a more academic point of view. Because I think it's important for people studying magic to step outside the magic books a little bit, because it kind of gives you a myopic worldview or a view of things. And again, it's like things like the PGM are really popular, but we're kind of pulling these out of thin air, and we don't really have this kind of, this personal foundation in it. And so one of the things that was nice about that podcast, one of his early ones, where he discusses, okay, where does the term magic come from? It's really basic things, and things that we may not think about. We don't like the word religion today. Well, when is magic a religion, and when is a religion magic? And I think it's important to kind of answer these questions for ourselves, and kind of put this into like a real world application. That's one of the virtues of philosophy, really, is it isn't that you identify yourself as a Platonist or a Neoplatonist or Aristotelian or whatever philosopher you want to name. None of that really is that important. What's important is absorbing all these different ideas and being able to apply it. And one of my favorite things is Plato talks about in a few places where he describes the cosmos as a living thing, as an animal. And like any animal, there's a mind and there's a body. And the body moves according to the mind. So the visible universe to us is the body. That's the planets and the stars and everything. And so then you could deduce then the purpose of astrology is, or astrologers, is to interpret the mind of the universe, right? And you're not going to get that from a book on astrology. And conversely, astrology, as we know, it didn't exist when Plato wrote that. So there's a lot of putting together that we can do in our minds, and and to a great degree, magic and astrology are part of our mind. I mean, I want to be too new age about it, but there's a mental expression of this. It's an expression of a philosophy, and so that's my 2 cents. So yeah, I say branch out, read other things besides books on magic, but that podcast is a great way to get your feet wet, because in maybe a 5-part podcast of 30-minute episodes, you might get a primer in Plotinus, that you're not gonna get anywhere else.
I'll leave a link down in the description to that podcast. Shwep, right?
It's called Shwep, which is a great name.
Yes. Yeah.
It's a great podcast.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Good recommendation. That's superb. Eric, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's been well, it's evening for me. I know it's kind of early afternoon for you, isn't it? Yeah, that's right. So yeah, thank you for taking some time to chat to us. And everyone who's watching, don't forget to leave a thumbs up and subscribe down below if you haven't done so already. And
thanks for having me again.
The good stuff down in the description. Yeah. Cheers, Eric. Speak to you very soon.
See you later.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care.